The call arrived at 5:47 p.m., precisely as I was merging onto the interstate with wrapped gifts occupying the passenger seat. Nathan's voice carried that particular quality, measured, selecting words rather than simply speaking them, that I'd learned over our years together meant he was constructing something. "Liv, slight change of plans," he said. "The restaurant had some plumbing emergency. Burst pipe, the whole mess. I'll just grab something quick with a few colleagues from the office instead. Don't bother waiting." I asked whether I should hunt for an alternative venue. He declined too rapidly, with the decisiveness of someone whose evening had already been meticulously arranged without me in it. I told him happy birthday, that I loved him. He reciprocated and disconnected before I'd even finished speaking. For a moment, the turn signal continued its rhythmic clicking. Something ancient and familiar, an instinct honed across 2 decades of marriage, whispered that I shouldn't abandon my current trajectory. I didn't consciously decide to continue toward Marchetti's. I simply never changed course. As the traffic thinned during my drive downtown, my mind became unusually clear, turning over details I'd somehow managed to compartmentalize. Since Nathan had made partner at his engineering firm in March, his calendar had exploded with engagements I wasn't included in, dinners I couldn't quite envision, obligations that seemed to multiply without explanation. I'd attributed it to the predictable ambition of a man in his late 40s attempting to reinvent himself, to prove something to people who'd previously dismissed him. But there had been other indicators, smaller ones I'd carefully sorted into that same convenient narrative without truly examining them. Chloe, his daughter from his first marriage, had been calling more frequently, though not for me. She and I had always maintained pleasant distance, yet increasingly she'd whisper conversations to Nathan behind his office door. Then there was the way Rebecca's name had begun surfacing in conversation, introduced gradually, like someone deliberately adding seasoning, so the flavor never arrives as a shock. Rebecca mentioned K.H. Lowe's having a difficult semester, he'd say casually, as though his ex-wife commenting on their shared child was the most ordinary thing imaginable. Perhaps it was. I'd wanted it to be. The restaurant parking lot lay across from Marchetti's, the very establishment Nathan and I had selected together when we still had a future. I positioned the car in shadow between streetlights and stepped out, telling myself I only wanted to verify whether any actual plumbing disaster existed, whether workmen and caution tape cluttered the space, whether managers were genuinely apologizing to disappointed guests. I've always been proficient at constructing such narratives for myself. The dining room glowed warmly through the front glass, untouched by plumbing disasters. Rather than enter through the main entrance, some protective instinct guided me along the sidewalk, into shadow, where the self-conscious parts of me couldn't argue with what my body already knew. Through the side window, I discovered the corner table he eternally requested, his preferred vantage point, back against the wall. He was laughing, genuinely laughing, head tilted backward in the manner he'd once laughed with me, before laughter became something he reserved for other rooms. Rebecca Lawson sat opposite him. At 48, her hair remained dark and lustrous, her green dress making her appear younger than her years, more assured than I'd managed in 23 seasons of trying. Beside her, Chloe leaned into her mother's shoulder, documenting the moment on her mobile device. Between them rested the cake, white frosting, gilded script. "Happy 50th birthday, Dad." 4 place settings occupied the table. 3 people sat around it. One chair remained empty, angled slightly away from the table as though someone had pulled it out before reconsidering. I stood motionless on the pavement, observing my husband's family, his other family, celebrating a milestone that apparently belonged to more than just the 2 of us. I didn't feel compelled to burst through the doors demanding explanations. I didn't weep. What I experienced was stranger and far colder than either reaction, a kind of crystalline understanding, like watching a photograph you've examined 100 times suddenly reorganize itself into an entirely different image, one that had existed hidden within those same lines all along. That unoccupied chair wasn't awaiting me. It never had been. It simply remained because even Nathan, constructing his lie, hadn't possessed the courage to request the restaurant remove a 4th setting. Some cowardly fragment of him had needed it acknowledged, if only as an absence. I returned to my vehicle without anyone inside detecting my presence. The dinner hadn't been canceled. I had been. I remained in the automobile afterward, engine silent, hands still gripping the steering wheel, as though I was navigating somewhere rather than nowhere. The parking area hummed with insects circling the overhead lights in senseless loops. I recognized the metaphor immediately. I'd been performing identical rotations, circling something without ever drawing sufficiently near to comprehend it clearly. Instead of dissolving into tears or telephoning him, I commenced something that startled me. Methodically, the way I'd previously reviewed quarterly reports during my logistics management career, I began remembering. Not in scattered, frantic fragments, but systematically, searching for the hidden pattern within numbers that seemed random in isolation. 6 months prior, Nathan had altered his phone passcode. Work security requirements, he'd explained, client confidentiality following a data breach at a competitor. I'd accepted this without resistance because such matters occurred at his professional level. Partners possessed responsibilities. Partners harbored secrets belonging to other people's enterprises, not their own marriages. 4 months prior, Thursday dinners emerged, supposedly client relations, always vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. He'd arrive home already showered, changed into casual garments he maintained in his office locker for a gym he supposedly frequented afterward. I'd teased him about smelling of soap rather than whiskey. He'd laughed, suggesting he'd begun taking his health seriously approaching 50. I'd believed him because belief had consistently been simpler than alternatives, and for 23 years, belief had generally proven justified. 3 months prior, I'd observed Chloe declining every invitation that included me. My sister's retirement celebration, family barbecues where Nathan was invited. Always excuses, workplace demands, headaches, existing commitments. Yet she'd rendezvous with Nathan separately, meeting him for lunch on occasions excluding me. I'd categorized this as typical, a daughter simply wanting paternal time, love expressing itself in different configurations. 8 months prior, he'd returned home with a slim naval case from an uptown jeweler sheepish. A client gift, he'd claimed, something for the spouse of a business prospect. Corporate gesture, he'd termed it, a common practice among wealthy enterprises facilitating contracts. I'd discovered the receipt in his coat during laundry weeks afterward, nearly $3,000, and replaced it untouched because I'd declined to imagine there was anything requiring discovery. Sitting in that parking lot, I understood I'd assembled a jigsaw with shuttered eyes, sensing each piece, deciding it fit because maintaining the complete picture mattered more than confronting the image. I drove homeward deliberately, traversing the route past the elementary school, where K.H. Lowe had ridden her bicycle before Nathan existed in my life, past the coffee establishment, where he and I had first discussed building something together. The house stood dark upon my arrival. I sat in the driveway supplementary minutes, then ventured inside and performed something I hadn't accomplished in years. I opened the banking application on my telephone. Not from distrust initially, simply habit, the manner one checks whether before retiring. Yet once I'd begun scrolling through our shared credit card statement, I couldn't cease. Restaurant expenses littered the records, nearly weekly at establishments significantly finer than sandwich shops adjacent to his workplace. £200 here, $300 there. Consistently during dinner hours. Consistently amounts suggesting multiple diners or something considerably more involved than solitary meals. I generated a spreadsheet, the same one I'd abandoned when exiting corporate employment, previously used for departmental budgeting. I commenced entering dates, establishments, amounts. I cross-referenced them against Nathan's shared calendar, maintained from years prior when we'd coordinated our daughter's college visitations, when our days still overlapped on paper. The pattern surfaced rapidly. Thursdays, almost without exception. Occasional Fridays. Charges clustering around dates insignificant to me but apparently momentous for someone else. Rebecca's birthday, which I only recognized because Nathan had mentioned it offhandedly long ago, and I'd archived it involuntarily. When he arrived home late that evening, smelling faintly of garlic and wine, offering apologies for the canceled dinner that never once acknowledged his actual location, I listened without confronting him. I assured him everything was satisfactory, that I'd purchased takeaway and viewed a program. He accepted this with the ease of someone believing whatever proved convenient, then ascended to shower. I remained in the darkened kitchen, my spreadsheet luminous on the counter, months of unremark. Able transactions arranged in orderly rows, finally revealing sense after deliberate obscuration. Around midnight, I recognized I'd transformed from wife awaiting explanation into someone constructing evidence. Nathan proved unexpectedly transparent the following morning. His rehearsed sentences arrived with mechanical precision. Encountered Chloe last evening, actually, he mentioned, pouring cream into his coffee with calculated disinterest. Grabbed something quickly. Lovely, I replied, meaning it to sound precisely as unremarkable as it did. How's she managing? Occupied, you understand how she is. He deposited a kiss upon my crown, the identical easy affection he'd demonstrated across 23 years, and I permitted myself to feel it without displaying concern, because any visible reaction would have signaled something I wasn't prepared for him to recognize. I prepared his preferred eggs, yolks merely setting, and queried about his schedule while he complained about extended client conferences. By the moment he departed, carrying his briefcase, planting a farewell kiss against my cheekbone, he'd genuinely convinced himself his wife of 23 years suspected absolutely nothing. After permitting 20 minutes to ensure he wasn't returning for forgotten items, I ventured into his office. I want to assert I experienced guilt. Truthfully, I didn't, not precisely. What I encountered resembled the sensation of finally opening a door I'd stood before for months, fingers resting upon the handle, awaiting authorization that would never originate from him. Across 23 years, I'd never investigated him, which constituted its own revelation. Nathan had never genuinely imagined I would. Within the bottom desk drawer, beneath outdated warranty documents, I discovered a slim accordion folder, the variety intended for receipts and tax records. His handwriting identified it, MISC business. I progressed through it methodically. Restaurant receipts corresponding with those I'd already documented from credit statements, though several displayed handwritten annotations, dates, names, occasionally merely initials. RL recurred frequently. So did CP asterisk. I required minimal time deciphering the identities. Boutique hotel invoices followed. 3 establishments, all from a location perhaps 40 minutes beyond the city. The variety featuring spa facilities and vineyard vistas. The location Nathan and I had once discussed visiting for our 20th anniversary, abandoned indefinitely because his professional obligations supposedly prevented a 2-week departure. Wine acquisitions from a specialty merchant I didn't recognize, perpetually paired bottles, consistently purchased on Thursdays, consistently charged to his card. Garage parking receipts from a facility adjacent to Rebecca's residential district, which I only recognized because I'd driven past her former residence years prior, propelled purely by idle curiosity following Nathan's mention of her relocation to the region. Beneath everything, a Marchetti's receipt, from last evening, 4 place settings, though merely 3 guests had occupied seats. The total encompassing gratuity approximated £400. Beneath the itemized summary, printed diminutively, appeared the reservation proprietor. Parker, party of 4 asterisk, not workplace colleagues, not a rapid encounter with Chloe, but a reservation under our mutual surname at a restaurant where Nathan and I had acknowledged 3 anniversaries. I reconstructed everything precisely as it had been. The folder squared, the drawer shut with identical gentleness he customarily employed. Then I remained seated in his office chair, gazing at nothing, before reaching for my telephone. Daniel Brooks had served as my accountant since before I'd encountered Nathan, a constant, resolute presence throughout every significant financial decision I'd undertaken. He answered immediately, as he invariably did, as though the entirety of his profession had been anticipatory. Olivia, he greeted warmly, belated birthday felicitations to Nathan. How did the celebration transpire? Not according to plan, I responded, and something within my utterance must have communicated more than I'd intended, because he adopted that particular silence Daniel employed while already performing calculations. I disclosed everything: the canceled celebration that hadn't been canceled, the restaurant window, the documentation, the recurring Thursday patterns spanning months, the hotel expenses, the parking tickets accumulated around a neighborhood I'd possessed no justification to comprehend. Daniel refrained from interrupting once. Upon completion, he exhaled gradually, the sound of someone setting down a beverage he'd forgotten holding. "Olivia, attend carefully," he instructed. "This isn't capricious expenditure. Capricious expenditure doesn't systematize itself around someone's timetable across months. This demonstrates organization. Someone has administered this meticulously, which indicates somebody's been depending upon you remaining oblivious. What should I accomplish?" I inquired. "Not presently," he responded. "Avoid confronting him. Not this evening, not this week. The instant he comprehends your awareness, he'll either deteriorate in ways concealing everything hastily, or he'll become meticulous in ways concealing everything more thoroughly. Currently, you possess advantage. You understand something he doesn't. That possesses greater significance than conversation." He continued, "Should you require it subsequently, legitimately speaking, you'll require considerably more than suspicions and receipts. You'll require the comprehensive picture. Ascertain where the finances genuinely travel, live, everything. Subsequently we'll establish what you do with the discovery." I observed the driveway through the office glass, presently empty of Nathan's vehicle, sunlight crossing the vacant concrete. Something within myself shifted from wounded to methodical. "Affirmative," I agreed. "I'll ascertain it." Daniel appeared 2 days subsequently, carrying his laptop and account statements spanning 3 decades. That meticulous preparation rekindled my appreciation for his long-standing management of my finances. We positioned ourselves at the kitchen table, the identical surface where Nathan had consumed his eggs, declaring his fabrication about encountering Chloe, and commenced dismantling 2 decades of shared finances, transaction by transaction. "There," Daniel articulated after approximately 60 minutes, indicating the display with that particular composure he employed upon locating something warranting attention. "Consistent transfer. Modest, 600 monthly, systematically withdrawing across 4 years, labeled personal, with nothing further specifying destination." He navigated through to the receiving account information, cross-referencing against an antiquated shared tax filing predating our marriage, still displaying Rebecca's particulars from prior to their divorce finalization, back when Nathan and I had exercised due diligence before matrimony. The account numbers corresponded. "That's her," Daniel stated quietly. 600 monthly, every single month for 4 years. That represents over £28,000 live, and that constitutes merely a solitary line. Identified additional patterns once we recognized what to investigate. Compensation to a property management enterprise administering a residential complex 20 minutes from Rebecca's earlier address. Her quarterly condominium fees, stretching backward almost 6 years. A supplementary payment stream to a student loan servicer, not under Nathan's designation, not mine, yet effortlessly traceable through a shared account Nathan apparently considered more private than it genuinely was. K.H. Lowe's advanced educational debt being methodically erased at £200 increments. Property taxation for a residence I didn't recognize until Daniel investigated and ascertained it belonged to Rebecca, procured 8 years prior, financing partially addressed through a loan co-signed by Nathan. I experienced my stomach descending upon reading this. "There's additional," Daniel continued, his jaw tightening in manner I'd never witnessed in 15 years administering my finances through every peak and valley. 2 recreational expeditions, Charleston and the Outer Banks, both arranged through a travel merchant, both billed to a card concluding in digits corresponding to Nathan's business account. Both journeys encompassing 4 explorers. I reclined in my chair, regarding the numerical landscape extended across the table. Months of meticulous, patient documentation revealing something I hadn't permitted myself fully to contemplate until that precise instant. He wasn't reconstructing a relationship with them, I articulated gradually, comprehension materializing like frigid water, sudden and irreversible. He never severed the original one. Daniel withheld response momentarily. He closed his laptop gently and interlaced his fingers, the comportment he adopted before expressing something he recognized I required hearing, regardless of preference. From the evidence before me, Nathan's been sustaining Rebecca and KH Lowe economically, persistently, for perhaps 6 years, possibly considerably longer. I'd require additional historical investigation for certainty. This isn't someone who reconnected with his prior partner recently from sentimentality or obligation. This constitutes someone who never genuinely relinquished his initial family and constructed an existence in duplicate, financed discreetly through assets that constituted legitimately yours equally as his. I contemplated all the modest sacrifices I'd accepted without recognizing I was accepting them. The kitchen modernization we'd postponed twice due to market unpredictability. Liddy, the Mediterranean anniversary excursion, discussed endlessly but perpetually deferred because Nathan maintained the enterprise required him too profoundly that particular year to disappear. I'd imagined those represented mutual determinations made collaboratively for understandable reasons. They hadn't been distributed, they'd been financed elsewhere. The celebration, I said quietly. It wasn't the commencement of something, it represented routine, something they'd been executing for years, wasn't it? Based on what I'm examining, Daniel replied, I'd hypothesize affirmatively. Birthday expenditures appear chronologically, too. Restaurant payments surrounding this identical period, spanning historical investigation further than you'd anticipate for something recent. Something fractured quietly within my chest. Not dramatically, not loudly, resembling the sound ice produces immediately preceding structural failure. A modest settling indicating the ground beneath you was never as solid as previously imagined. I hadn't disrupted their family, I articulated, half addressing Daniel, half confronting myself, experimenting with spoken words to verify their accuracy. I'd merely disrupted the account he narrated regarding what our marriage constituted. Daniel placed his hand momentarily across mine, the gesture of enduring companionship rather than fiscal counsel. Liv, I require you to comprehend this distinctly because I genuinely regard your welfare, not merely your economic interests. You must safeguard yourself currently, not following conversation with him, not after processing this emotionally. Presently, establish accounts he's unaware of. Redirect your consulting compensation somewhere beyond his accessibility. Catalog everything you've discovered. Preserve copies. Archive materials somewhere outside this residence. Whatever you elect to undertake with this intelligence, determine it from authority, not from the center of conversation where he orchestrates narrative. I acknowledged, though fragments of consciousness remained stationed in that restaurant parking lot from days prior, contemplating an unoccupied seat that had never been constructed for me, ultimately comprehending it had never remained empty accidentally. It had been maintained deliberately, patiently, for a family configuration that had persisted throughout my marriage, concealed beneath the version I'd imagined I inhabited. Affirmative, I articulated, steadier than anticipated. Describe precisely what I must execute. The subsequent 3 days proceeded with strange, controlled silence, the stillness before tempestuous conditions arrive. Everything displayed ordinariness externally, while everything fundamentally transformed beneath. I inaugurated a private financial account at an institution across town Nathan had never patronized and possessed no explanation to investigate. I contacted my 3 largest consulting clients, casually requesting future compensation redirect to another account for accounting justification. None interrogated the adjustment. I'd cultivated sufficient professional credibility that modest administrative modifications registered as unremarkable. I engaged Patricia Voss, a solicitor Daniel recommended, intelligent, measured, listening without evident judgment, merely posing clarifying inquiries. She illuminated what I'd already suspected. The resources Nathan had channeled to Rebecca and KH Lowe across years utilizing shared finances without my cognizance or acceptance would demonstrate considerable significance if circumstances progressed toward dissolution. She instructed continued documentation. She instructed silence regarding Nathan until every component aligned. I froze 2 recurring joint transfers, the ones Daniel had identified connected to Rebecca's residential association and KH Lowe's educational debt, quietly redirecting that capital instead. I reassured myself I wasn't perpetrating transgression. I was simply declining continuation of remuneration for familial relationships that had never once acknowledged my existence. Nathan detected nothing. He navigated those 3 days with the uncomplicated assurance of someone convinced his secondary existence remained safely concealed behind his initial. He deposited morning farewells upon my lips. He inquired about my consulting undertakings during supper, feigning identical curiosity he'd perpetually demonstrated, and I reciprocated with equivalent warmth, because I'd acquired profound appreciation for how effortlessly matrimony operated purely on automaticity, propelled forward by nothing beyond muscle memory, and assumed continuity of yesterday's confidence. My telephone commenced ringing just following 8 o'clock that evening, Nathan, and I recognized something different immediately. Not his smooth, rehearsed celebration call inflection, but something compressed, approached by embarrassment he struggled containing. "Quick inquiries," he articulated. "Has something occurred with the visa? It's not processing." I occupied the parlor with a cooling beverage beside me, regarding the telephone momentarily before responding, experiencing strangely peaceful focus, the manner a surgeon experiences prior to commencing the fundamental incision. Not detached precisely, but concentrated beyond hesitation. "Where are you?" I inquired, despite already comprehending. "Supper with Chloe," a pause extending excessively, "and somebody." Restaurant noise materialized behind his utterances. Glasses, conversation. The acoustic atmosphere of a dining establishment I recognized because I'd remained outside its glass 5 evenings prior. I pictured him positioning himself just beyond the entrance, telephone against his ear, attempting to maintain quiet volume sufficient that his alternate family wouldn't detect the comprehension commencing to infiltrate his articulation. "The card should operate appropriately," I articulated uniformly. "Attempt the Amex." Attempted, I perceived him exhale, the sound of someone anticipating comfort and encountering something altogether different. "That one's declining, too. Nothing produces comprehension. We've encountered no complications." I repositioned resources, I articulated. "Financial administration. Daniels assisted me consolidating our accounts." Silence extended across the transmission, prolonged enough for me to identify a waiter's distant inquiry regarding supplementary payment methodology, perhaps temporarily stepping aside toward resolution. Nathan muttered something, apology, justification, the particular scrambling of someone recognizing his carefully isolated spheres had unexpectedly become undeniably connected. "Liv," he articulated, diminished currently, approaching supplication. "What's transpiring? Did something occur with the account?" I observed our garden through the window, the roses I'd maintained across 23 summers, since the spring succeeding our matrimony. I contemplated the unoccupied seat at Marchetti's, positioned slightly apart from the table, awaiting nobody, because everyone requiring significance already occupied positions. "I discontinued financing a family I don't participate in," I stated. The silence that ensued diverged from preceding ones. Lengthier, denser, populated by everything Nathan wasn't articulating yet, because he hadn't fully comprehended what I'd already grasped. I recognized his breathing, could nearly visualize the expression crossing his features, the manifestation he manifested when professional complications unexpectedly demonstrated themselves as considerably more substantial than preliminary evaluation. "Olivia," he initiated. I terminated the transmission prior to completion. I positioned the telephone upon the side table and remained completely motionless, perceiving the residential space around me, the refrigerator humming minimally within the cooking area, atmosphere circulating through the maple exterior. I anticipated something monumental. Sorrow perhaps, or terror, or the uncontrolled dissolution I'd perpetually envisioned accompanying a moment analogous to this. Rather, I experienced something closer to stillness, the particular serenity arriving after you ultimately articulate aloud, the thing you've been maintaining silently for excessively prolonged duration. 23 years, I contemplated, and it required singular declined card within a restaurant I'd formerly cherished for him to finally comprehend that I recognized. I elevated my beverage, It had grown frigid, though I consumed it regardless, observing exterior atmosphere continue circulating through the maple, indifferent to everything that had shifted within the residence beneath it. Nathan arrived home 40 minutes subsequently, and I distinguished the driveway preceding the entrance, velocity excessively swift across gravel. The mechanism disengaging mid-turn as opposed to gliding fluidly into stationary position. He penetrated the entrance already communicating, jacket halfway disrobed, keys remaining within his grasp. Olivia, we require discussion regarding this immediately. I concur, I articulated, and my peacefulness apparently startled him considerably more than volatility could have. He'd clearly anticipated entering confrontation, something dramatic he could counter with identical amplitude, divert with wounded protests, redirect until conversation became concerning my emotional reaction rather than his activity. Rather, he encountered me positioned at the dining table, manila envelope situated previously, my extremities interlaced atop it. He sat gradually, resembling someone uncertain. The chair would accommodate his weight, like the atmosphere itself had fundamentally transformed since his prior presence. It's not precisely what you're imagining, he articulated. Narrate precisely what it represents. Subsequently, I requested. I inaugurated the envelope and commenced positioning contents between us, deliberate as cards being distributed. Bank statements with recurring transfers emphasized in pigmentation, residential association payments, educational debt documentation, property taxation records for residences neither of us had ever deliberated possessing. Receipts spanning years, predominantly bearing a reservation designation he hadn't troubled disguising. Ultimately, 3 photographic images I'd captured through restaurant glass days prior. Nathan experiencing genuine amusement. Rebecca positioned beside him. Chloe leaning toward her mother's shoulder, the confection between them incandescent beneath ambient illumination. Nathan examined each documentation without physically contacting them, his countenance navigating something I'd never witnessed previously. Not the educated composure of someone apprehended in trivial fabrication, but the progressive dissolution of somebody comprehending the deception had expanded excessively substantially to endure exposure to transparency. Rebecca's encountered financial adversity, he ultimately articulated, utterance diminished. Following her final commercial venture deteriorated, Chloe, K.H. Lowe implored me assisting her mother, articulated she couldn't witness her forfeit the residential property, couldn't witness her persisting solo. I assured myself it represented provisional assistance. Subsequently it transformed into recurring obligation. Subsequently it transformed into. He halted, massaging his facial features. I'm uncertain when it transformed into what it transformed into. 6 years, I articulated quietly. Minimal, following Daniel's assessment. I comprehend the optics. Do you? I maintained composed utterance, though something underneath had commenced hardening. Because from my positioning, it represents your construction of complete secondary obligation utilizing capital constituting equally mine, absent ever interrogating whether I'd have regarded participation as desirable. Potentially, I would have acknowledged agreement, Nathan. Potentially, 6 years prior had you approached and articulated, Rebecca's struggling, K.H. Lowe's anxious. Can we facilitate them? I would have affirmed yes, I'm not malicious, you comprehend this. He paused again, mandible contracting. I suspected your response would represent rejection. I contemplated you'd experience being intimidated by them or harbor resentment, toward them or toward me regarding my continued investment in their welfare. It appeared uncomplicated, administering it discreetly. You decided my response preceding ever requesting the interrogation, I articulated. That's not sheltering me from challenging discussion, Nathan. That constitutes determining I didn't deserve involvement in one. He lacked response to that assertion. I observed him regarding the photographic images repeatedly, his expression secured within confidential amusement, comprehending he'd imagined the moment remained completely individual, and something within his posture commenced yielding internally. The educated straightforwardness he typically inhabited gradually drained. Olivia petitioned me, he articulated. Permit me to restore this manufacturing restitution. I'll terminate everything. I'll sever all connections if that constitutes what you require. I contemplate you haven't comprehended what transpired beneath the surface, I articulated. My utterance persisted constantly, even as something within my thoracic region ached in a manner I hadn't anticipated. Sorrow materializing tardily to a remembrance ceremony it ought to have participated in years prior. This doesn't genuinely concern the capital. Daniel and Patricia can segregate the monetary components. This involves the circumstance that across 6 years you maintained a complete alternate family you were discreetly sustaining, commemorating with, providing for. Whilst I remained seated reverse from you every single evening imagining we constructed something cooperatively. You didn't merely conceal expenditure from me, Nathan. You concealed matrimony. You maintained dual conjugal arrangements, occurring simultaneously, and I constituted the solitary individual remaining ignorant she was distributing you. He extended across the table toward my extremity, and I permitted him contact momentarily, perceiving the recognized affection of his appendages, the weight of 23 years compressing into that minimal contact. Subsequently, I gently withdrew my extremity. I undid my matrimonial band. I hadn't anticipated performing the action at that particular instant, but it appeared unexpectedly appropriate, the obvious conclusion to everything positioned between us. I positioned it beside the photographic images, golden metal acquiring the illumination. You didn't forfeit me this evening, I articulated quietly. You forfeited me the moment you determined, manufacturing alternate matrimony within this and permit. Ting me to spend 6 years providing for an existence I was never welcomed into. Nathan regarded the band as though he didn't comprehend its significance, though I suspected somewhere beneath his astonishment he comprehended completely. Olivia, he articulated again, diminished presently, approaching desperation. I ascended from the table, departing the envelope, the photographic images, the band, everything positioned precisely. I'll occupy the guest chamber this evening, I articulated. We can continue communicating subsequently when you've possessed the opportunity to determine what you genuinely desire expressing rather than what you conceptualize might facilitate this become effortless. I ascended the stairs and shut the entrance gently behind me. For the initial instance in 5 days, I permitted myself to genuinely weep, not originating from melancholy regarding forfeited components, I recognized midway through, but something resembling alleviation. The exhausting obligation of maintaining ignorance was ultimately terminated. 6 weeks transpired prior to Nathan authentically comprehending I wasn't oscillating. He initiated, the manner people initiate when they've never authentically confronted repercussions previously, with apologies circumnavigating into clarifications circumnavigating back into requests for supplementary opportunity. He suggested severing every connection to Rebecca and K.H. Lowe entirely, as though comprehensive severance might somehow invalidate 6 years of systematic deception. I articulated that wasn't my aspiration either. Reprimanding K.H. Lowe regarding familial devotion or commanding Nathan abandon a daughter he'd elevated wouldn't reconstruct what he'd fractured. What he'd fractured wasn't reconstructible through elimination. It necessitated something he'd never previously accorded me throughout those 6 years. Transparency, willingly contributed prior to I necessitated pursuing it. I documented separation paperwork on Tuesday morning, late October, within Patricia's workplace, accompanied by documentation so meticulous that Patricia articulated, something approaching a claim, that she infrequently observed circumstances materialize this comprehensively. Every transaction recognized, every asset identified, every year of discrete, persistent infidelity positioned chronologically in manner departing minimal area for Nathan's legal representative to contend there'd been equivocation regarding fiscal pathways. Rebecca recognized her authentic circumstances not extensively afterward. I ascertained secondhand via Daniel, who'd learned via distributed companionship, the manner restricted municipalities and restricted societal systems perpetually dispersed undisclosed communications. Nathan could no longer discreetly compensate her residential association. He could no longer manufacture K.H. Lowe's educational obligations evaporate incrementally. The supper engagements terminated. The anniversary commemorations Rebecca and K.H. Lowe had apparently orchestrated every year absent my consciousness straightforwardly terminated, because the capital that had assembled them across 6 years discontinued circulating, unrestricted from my unawareness. I wouldn't represent I experienced nothing discovering this. A diminutive, penetrating gratification manifested, keener than I'd anticipated from someone perpetually regarding herself as insufficiently composed for anything approximating retribution. Predominantly, nonetheless, I experienced something quieter and stranger, not specific victory precisely, but comprehensive resolution, resembling observing equilibrium previously inclined across years eventually returning to horizontal. K.H. Lowe contacted me individually approaching the conclusion of proceedings, her utterance compressed with anger, I recognized notwithstanding the sensation of bearing it directed at me. She articulated I'd dismantled her paternal parent's felicity, that I'd maintained coldness and mathematical precision, that a genuine spouse would have identified methodology for giving and advancing collectively regarding familial welfare. K.H. Lowe, I articulated, maintaining my utterance as tender as possible. I invested 6 years experiencing the component of something your paternal parent never truthfully disclosed to me. I regret this demonstrates distressing for you, however I didn't destroy anything. I discontinued subsidizing something I was never invited to participate within. She terminated communication absent reciprocating, and I didn't reconnect. Certain connections, I'd matured to comprehend, didn't constitute my obligation repairing. Subsequent to the calendar year transition, the settlement became authoritative. I conserved the residence we distributed across 2 decades, though I ultimately opted toward disposition. Excessive residential spaces maintained reminiscences I declined maintaining circulated throughout my diurnal existence. The cooking R.E. where I'd manufactured his preferred breakfast, the morning succeeded his celebration, completely accepting his fiction. The workplace where I'd discovered the documentation redirecting everything. The vehicular pathway where his automobile's apparatus had shrieked excessive momentum, the evening he ultimately comprehended I acknowledged. I procured modest residential property, an understated waterside residence 40 minutes outside the urban center, possessing expansive glass configurations capturing morning radiance, accompanied by modest maritime access where I could situate with stimulation beverage, monitoring environment rather than monitoring for automotive illumination. I persisted in my consulting functioning, genuinely broadened it, accepting novel clientage presently that I maintained temporal capacity and intellectual resources that previously disappeared into matrimony demanding significantly greater preservation than I'd originally recognized. Daniel circulated regularly, predominantly Sunday mornings, perpetually bearing dual beverages from the merchant adjacent his workplace that produced the particular stimulation I preferred. We'd position ourselves upon maritime access, discoursing regarding inconsequential subjects, his descendants, literary compositions he was perusing, avifauna commencing reciting in proximity. It characterized comfort in manner matrimonial discourse with Nathan had terminated characterizing, substantially prior to I genuinely comprehended explanation. One distinct Sunday, approaching the year-span conclusion, Daniel articulated the interrogation I suspected he'd been maintaining for a considerable interval. "Do you harbor regret?" he inquired. The contact, the financial termination that evening, fairly dramatic methodology concluding circumstances. I contemplated genuinely prior to articulating, observing avian species selecting its trajectory along shallows adjacent the access. Negativity regarding the contact, I articulated. However, it wasn't genuinely the contact transforming my existence, Daniel. It constituted ultimately permitting what my personal senses had attempted to communicate months preceding. The contact represented the instant I discontinued feigning I hadn't previously witnessed substantiation. Daniel beamed, elevating his stimulation beverage diminutively, particular confidential toast. Toward ultimately having confidence in your personal consciousness, he articulated. Toward ultimately having confidence in my personal consciousness, I repeated, and articulated it with substantially greater commitment than I'd communicated nearly whatever across preceding years. I frequently contemplate presently that unoccupied positioning at Marchetti's, positioned apart from where Nathan's alternate family commemorated. For an extended interval, I recognized that positioning as insult, substantiation that I'd experienced substitution, quietly scripted out of narrative, I'd imagined constituting my focal point. I comprehend it distinctly presently. That positioning never symbolized my non-existence. It represented merely the spatial capacity where deception terminated expanding. The positioning where 6 years of meticulous concealment ultimately possessed nowhere persisting disguised. Occasionally, infidelity doesn't constitute the instant somebody fabricates to you. It constitutes the instant they grow convinced you'll perpetually decline examining the fabrication. Occasionally, the strongest reclamation doesn't involve destroying those who distressed you. It involves straightforwardly, determinedly declining maintaining subsidy for existence they constructed absent acknowledging you genuinely participated.